The quantum resonance readings from Mars weren't just data, they were singing. Patterns emerged that felt almost musical, and then it appeared. Not descended, not approached. A colossal vessel materialized in Earth's orbit as if it had always been there. Every scientist on the planet held their breath. This wasn't first contact as we imagined it. This was something far more unsettling, and one man would volunteer to face it head-on. Dr. Eva Rostova was halfway through her third cup of coffee when the anomaly started. The monitor in front of her typically showed the gentle hum of quantum foam from the Mars probe, a predictable background noise she'd learned to ignore. It was the kind of data you file away, but not this morning. The readings began to pulse, not in a chaotic scatter, but in a steady metronomic beat. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching the screen. The pattern held, a repeating sequence of peaks and troughs aligning with mathematical precision. She tapped her console, ran a diagnostic. The equipment checked out. She called over a junior tech who just shrugged. Everything looked normal to him. An hour later, it wasn't just a beat. It was a melody. The quantum fluctuations began arranging themselves into harmonic intervals, a low C-sharp resonance echoed by a higher E, then a G. It formed a minor chord that hung in the data stream for a full 12 seconds before resolving. Eva felt a cold prickle on her neck. This wasn't random. Random doesn't resolve. She sent a priority alert to the other deep space monitoring stations. The responses trickled in over the next 20 minutes. The Canary Islands array saw it. The facility in Chile confirmed. The Antarctic outpost, buried under a kilometer of ice, sent back the same exact harmonic sequence. 4 different systems, on 4 different continents, all recording the same impossible music from the same point near Mars. The composition grew in complexity. It developed a rhythmic structure, a time signature. The harmonics began layering, creating counter-melodies that intertwined. It sounded less like cosmic background radiation and more like a string quartet tuning up in the void. Scientists started gathering around Eva's terminal, speaking in hushed tones. Someone joked that it was Martian elevator music. Nobody laughed. The question wasn't just what it was, but how it was possible. Quantum states don't arrange themselves into concertos. This suggested a sender. An intelligence that didn't just understand physics, but understood music. It was a signal, but not one built from ones and zeros. It was built from emotion and mathematics fused together. You look at raw data your whole career and you start to recognize its texture. This had a new texture. It felt composed, intentional. The eerie beauty of it was the most terrifying part. It wasn't a warning or a greeting. It was in performance. And we were the audience listening to a song broadcast from an empty planet, wondering who or what was singing. Exactly 28 minutes after the quantum music stopped, the ship arrived. It didn't approach. It manifested. One moment, orbital trackers showed clear skies. The next, a 3-kilometer-long vessel hung stationary over the Indian Ocean. No heat signature. No ion trail. No radar ping on approach. Every tracking station on the planet registered it at the same precise second, as if it had always been there and they'd all just failed to notice. Defense networks went from standby to full alert in under 60 seconds. Missile batteries across a dozen nations acquired the target automatically. Satellite feeds zoomed in. The thing was just floating there, serene and unmoving. Its surface wasn't metal or any known composite. It absorbed and reflected light in a way that hurt your eyes if you stared too long, like looking at oil on water or the inside of an abalone shell. It shimmered without moving. Astrophysicists ran the numbers. The energy required to move an object that mass from any possible point of origin to Earth orbit instantaneously wasn't just high. It was theoretical. It was the kind of number you use to power thought experiments about the end of the universe, not something you plug into a real-world equation. One scientist described it as trying to power a city by burning a single match. The math simply didn't work in our physics. The ship was a permanent, silent rebuke to everything we thought we knew. It held its position with an impossible stillness. No thrusters fired. No attitude adjustments. It didn't spin or wobble. It just sat there in perfect geostationary orbit, defying orbital mechanics, solar pressure, and every other force that should have pushed it off station. You could draw a line from its center to a fixed point on Earth and it wouldn't deviate by a centimeter. The military response was a study in controlled panic. In bunkers deep underground, generals argued over threat assessment protocols that had no category for this. Was it a weapon, a probe, a diplomatic envoy? The complete lack of any discernible activity made it more terrifying than any hostile action. One Air Force colonel kept repeating that it had bypassed every layer of early warning. Nothing gets that close without being seen. Nothing. The real question wasn't what it was doing here, but how it got here at all. Normal ships travel. They obey the laws of motion. They have a point A and a point B. This thing had no point A. It violated causality. It hadn't traveled through space. It had simply decided to exist in a new location. The implications of that were somehow more frightening than any weapon. A weapon you can understand. A ship that redefines the nature of reality itself is a different kind of problem entirely. It just hung there, a silent, shimmering question mark written across the sky, and waited for us to answer. The modified shuttle they'd sent James up in was state-of-the-art, but it felt like a rowboat drifting toward a skyscraper. The alien ship filled the viewport, its surface shifting and swirling like oil on water. It was beautiful in a way that made your stomach tighten. They'd received a perfect set of coordinates from the ship itself, a simple data packet containing a single point in space. No instructions, no manuals, just a destination. The pilot nudged the shuttle forward, the thrusters firing in tiny, nervous bursts. They came to a full stop exactly 100 meters from the shimmering hull. Then the hull changed. A section of it, roughly the size of a large aircraft hangar door, simply dissolved. It didn't slide open or retract. The material flowed apart like liquid mercury, pulling back to form a perfect circular opening. There was no light from within, just a deeper darkness that seemed to swallow the light from their shuttle. The pilot looked back at James and the two diplomats, his face pale. This was not in the training manual. The opening wasn't an airlock. It was a hole in reality. They crossed the threshold. The transition was silent. One moment they were in the familiar hum of their own shuttle. The next they were elsewhere. The air tasted different. It had the sharp, clean smell of ozone after a thunderstorm. But underneath it was something else, something sweet and organic, like crushed petals and damp earth. The light didn't come from fixtures or panels. It seemed to emanate from the very air and walls themselves, a soft, shadowless glow that left no corners dark. It was seamless, disorienting. Their escorts were waiting for them. 3 figures, tall and slender. Their limbs were elongated, moving with a fluid, economical grace that made human movement seem clumsy and loud. Their eyes were large, dark, and reflective, catching the ambient light like a cat's in the dark. They didn't speak. They simply bowed their heads in unison, a gesture that managed to be both respectful and deeply alien. They turned and led the way, their footsteps making no sound on the floor, which felt slightly soft and warm through the soles of James's boots. They were led into a larger chamber, its walls curved and organic. Waiting for them was another Zephyrian, this one adorned with subtle silver markings that traced patterns across their brow and robes. They inclined their head. "Welcome. I am Ambassador Thari. We apologize for the abruptness of our arrival." The voice was calm, melodic. The English was perfect, not just grammatically correct. It had the faint, almost undetectable accent of a classic mid-20th century newsreel broadcaster. James just stared. One of the diplomats, a woman named Elise, found her voice. You speak English. We have been monitoring your planetary transmissions for several of your decades," Starry said, as if discussing the weather, radio, television, digital networks. "It was necessary to understand the context of your development, the linguistic patterns, the cultural narratives. It is a fascinating, if often contradictory, tapestry." The explanation was simple, terrifyingly simple. They hadn't sent a message because they'd been listening to all of ours. They'd learned our language by eavesdropping on our history, our entertainment, our news, our arguments. They'd absorbed our entire cultural output as data, but one of them, it seemed, had done more than just study. One of them had listened. The formal reception was underway, a careful dance of diplomatic pleasantries. Ambassador Zathari was explaining their ship's energy matrix to a rapt, if nervous, group of scientists. That's when she entered. Princess Lyra didn't make a grand entrance. There was no fanfare, no announcement. One moment the doorway was empty, the next she was just there, as if she'd been part of the scenery all along and had simply decided to move. Her appearance was an exercise in near-miss biology. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, a familiar facial structure, but the proportions were subtly wrong. Her limbs were a fraction too long, her fingers too slender. Her eyes were the same reflective dark pools as the others. But there was a different kind of light behind them. She ignored protocol completely. She walked past her own ranking officials. She glided right by the lead human diplomat, who had a prepared speech already half out of his mouth. She didn't even seem to see them. Her entire focus was on James Mitchell. She stopped about a foot in front of him, well inside any human concept of personal space. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him. It wasn't a hostile stare. It was the way a geologist looks at an interesting rock formation, or a programmer looks at an elegant line of code. It was deeply analytical and utterly intense. Your work with recursive linguistic algorithms in noisy environments is what first caught my attention, she said. Her voice was softer than Thari's, more melodic, but her English was just as flawless. The way your species approaches problems with illogical but effective solutions. You call it a hack or a workaround. We do not have such concepts. We optimize. You create. She tilted her head. You built a particle accelerator to discover fundamental truths. You also used a melted chocolate bar in a microwave to measure the speed of light. This dissonance is fascinating. James could only stare back, his mind reeling. She wasn't just quoting data. She was synthesizing it on a level he couldn't follow. She seamlessly wove together high-level scientific concepts with pop culture detritus. The quality of mercy is not strained, she recited, perfectly capturing the cadence of Shakespeare's Portia. Then, without a pause, her tone shifted to something flat and modern. But then one does not simply walk into Mordor. It is a curious juxtaposition, grand idealism alongside mimetic stubbornness. She cited an obscure scientific paper on xenolinguistics from a decade ago that James himself had almost forgotten writing. Then she referenced a viral video of a cat failing to jump onto a counter that had been popular the previous year. A low, subtle hum seemed to pass through the Zephyrians in the room. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. You felt it through the floor. The other aliens were exchanging glances, a slight tightening around their eyes, a minute shift in posture. Their discomfort was palpable. This was not how things were done. A royal heir does not engage in unsanctioned deep cultural analysis with an alien delegate. It was too direct, too personal, too emotional. They had all studied humanity. They had all absorbed the transmissions. But for them, it was data. A cultural database to be understood for strategic or sociological purposes. For Lyra, it was clearly something else. She hadn't just studied the data stream. She had immersed herself in it. She had learned the language not just to communicate, but to understand the soul behind the words. She hadn't learned English from a dictionary. She'd learned it from Shakespeare and sitcoms, from news broadcasts and social media rants, from scientific journals and cooking shows. She hadn't just learned how humans talk, she'd learned how they think. And in doing so, she had profoundly unsettled her own people, who valued precision and order above all else. They saw a chaotic, contradictory mess. She saw a source of endless, brilliant creativity. The Zephyrian throne room was a forest of light. Crystalline structures rose from the floor and ceiling, intersecting in the middle of the vast chamber. Sunlight, or something like it, filtered through these prisms, fracturing into geometric patterns that drifted slowly across the walls and the assembled dignitaries. It was beautiful, cold, and deeply intimidating. The human delegation stood in a tight group, feeling conspicuously soft and organic in a place made of sharp, perfect angles. The queen sat perfectly still on a throne that seemed grown rather than built, her expression unreadable, a mask of serene authority. The formal greetings had been exchanged, precise and polite. It felt like the preamble to a very delicate business transaction. Then Lyra moved. It wasn't a step so much as a gliding shift in her position, a subtle breaking of formation that sent a visible ripple through the Zephyrian courtiers. Protocol demanded she remain with her cohort. She did not. She walked forward until she stood alone in the open space between the two delegations. The light patterns played over her silver-adorned robes. The room, already quiet, went absolutely silent. You could hear the soft hum of the ship's systems, a sound you usually felt and forgot about. Now you heard it. She turned to face the queen. Then she raised one slender arm, her finger extending to point directly, unmistakably, at James Mitchell. Her voice cut through the crystalline silence, clear and unwavering, without a trace of hesitation or doubt. "I want this human, Mother." The sentence hung in the air. For a moment, nobody breathed. The queen's composure, which had seemed as permanent as the ship itself, fractured. It was just a flicker, a minute widening of her dark, reflective eyes, a tiny tightening at the corner of her mouth. It was the first truly human expression anyone had seen on a Zephyrian face, and it was pure, unadulterated shock. James felt the weight of every gaze in the chamber land on him. It was a physical pressure. He could feel the confused stares of his own team, the horrified looks from the senior Zephyrians, the Queen's analytical shock. His ears roared with the silence. Lyra lowered her arm. She didn't look at anyone else. Her focus remained on the Queen, her tone shifting to one of calm, data-driven explanation. I do not mean as a servant or a curiosity. I mean as a consort, a bonded mate. She recited a series of neural compatibility indices, emotional resonance quotients, and cognitive synergy projections. She cited his published work on pattern recognition in nonlinear systems. She referenced the unique harmonic signature of his brainwaves as recorded during the initial contact briefing, how they had synced with the residual energy of the ship in a statistically impossible way. It was a courtship proposal delivered like a scientific dissertation. The Queen finally found her voice, though it sounded strained. Lyra, this is unprecedented. Our protocols for cross-species engagement are theoretical. The data is not theoretical, Lyra replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. His cognitive architecture complements our own. Where we see a logical path, he sees a branching tree of possibilities. Our civilization has optimized logic to its absolute limit. We have hit a developmental plateau. His species operates on intuition, on creative leaps that bypass logic entirely. They solve problems they do not fully understand with tools they did not know they had. This is not a weakness. It is a capability we lack, a capability we require. This is not an emotional whim. It is a strategic necessity. She hadn't chosen him on a feeling. She had chosen him on a spreadsheet. She had run the numbers on the entire human species, their entire cultural and scientific output, and his profile had risen to the top. He wasn't a romantic choice. He was an evolutionary one. She saw a key that could unlock a door her people didn't even know was there, and she was willing to break every rule in her culture's book to get it. The Queen's quiet reprimand hung in the crystalline air, a perfectly logical objection. Lyra didn't flinch. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod as if she'd been waiting for this exact argument. The court watched, a tableau of rigid postures and unblinking eyes. This was the core of the debate, and Lyra was prepared for it. Her defense wasn't emotional. It was evidential. She raised a hand, and the light in the chamber shifted, coalescing into a three-dimensional neural map that hovered between her and the Queen. Emotion is not an impediment to logic, she stated, her voice calm and precise. It is a different processing pathway, a complementary system. The neural map resolved, showing two distinct patterns side by side. One was a Zephyrian thought process, clean, direct, efficient lines of synaptic fire, a perfect A to B journey. The other was a human one. It looked like a chaotic explosion, a tangled web of connections firing in all directions at once. To the Zephyrian eye, it looked messy, inefficient, flawed. You see noise? Lyra said, gesturing to the human pattern. I see a parallel processing network. They do not think in straight lines. They feel their way toward a solution. The emotional centers of their brain are not separate from the logical ones. They are integrated. An intuitive leap is not a guess. It is the subconscious recognition of a pattern that the conscious, logical mind has not yet formulated. She offered examples. A human mathematician who dreamed the solution to a theorem, an engineer who fixed a complex machine by listening to its hum, a child who solved a logic puzzle by turning it upside down. Incidents her people had recorded and classified as anomalies. Lyra was arguing they were features, not bugs. An elder counselor, his silver markings more intricate than the others, spoke. His voice was like grinding stone. This feeling is subjective, unquantifiable, it cannot be relied upon. He represented centuries of tradition, the absolute primacy of cold, hard logic. A younger scientist, her markings of faint bronze, countered him. But it gets results our pure logic cannot. They're creative engineering solutions. They're art. These are not logical outputs, yet they possess an internal consistency, a different kind of order. The tension wasn't about right or wrong. It was about the fundamental definition of intelligence itself. Lyra brought up another visualization. This one showed two brainwave patterns, one human, one Zephyrian running separately. They were discordant, out of sync. Then she superimposed them. The chaotic human pattern and the rigid Zephyrian one didn't clash. They interlocked. The wild, intuitive spikes of the human pattern filled the silent gaps in the Zephyrian one. The stable, logical baseline of the Zephyrian pattern gave structure to the human chaos. Together, they formed a new, more complex harmonic, a blended intelligence. They are not opposites, she concluded, letting the synchronized patterns pulse in the air. They are harmonics. Our logic provides the melody. Their intuition provides the counter-melody. Alone, each is a simple tune. Together, they create a symphony. We have spent millennia perfecting the single note. They have spent their existence learning to play the chord. The philosophy wasn't about merging two warring concepts. It was about realizing they were two parts of a whole that had been split apart by evolution. The Zephyrian saw emotion as static on the line. Lyra was trying to explain it was the other half of the conversation. The dining hall was quiet, except for the low hum of the ship and the soft chime of crystal. The table they sat at looked like a single piece of polished amber, glowing from within. There were no chairs. The floor simply rose to meet them, forming perfect, comfortable contours to support their bodies. James and Sarah sat opposite Lyra, the bizarre spread of food between them. It didn't look like any meal they'd ever seen. A salad of iridescent blue leaves that pulsed with a soft light. Loaves of bread that were transparent and geometric like edible quartz crystals. Glasses filled with a liquid that swirled with internal lightning. It was beautiful and completely unappetizing. Lyra watched their hesitation with what might have been amusement. Her reflective eyes tracked their micro-expressions. The appearance is a byproduct of the nutrient compounds, she explained. Her tone was matter-of-fact, a scientist describing an experiment. She gestured to the shimmering salad. These leaves contain catalysts for cellular regeneration. They will subtly repair telomere degradation. She pointed to the crystalline bread. That is infused with minerals that temporarily enhance neural conductivity. It makes complex data patterns easier to visualize. Finally, she indicated the crackling drink. That will sharpen auditory and visual perception for approximately 20 of your minutes. It is a standard cognitive aid before complex tasks. Sarah picked up a glowing leaf, her skepticism warring with her curiosity. She took a small bite. Her eyes widened. It tastes like a chord, a C major chord. It wasn't a flavor she could describe in terms of sweet or sour. It was a sensation that translated directly into a musical feeling in her mind, a clean, resonant note of wellness. James broke off a piece of the clear bread. The texture was like cracking thin ice. He chewed slowly. The taste was neutral, almost like plain rice, but the effect was immediate. A complex equation he'd been struggling with for weeks suddenly rearranged itself in his mind. The solution was obvious. It wasn't that he was smarter. The path was just clearer, as if someone had turned on a light in a dark room. They ate. Cautiously at first, then with growing fascination. The effects were not subtle. The colors in the room became hyper-saturated, each shade distinct and vivid. The hum of the ship resolved into layers. He could pick out the low thrum of the power core, the higher frequency of the environmental systems, the nearly imperceptible whisper of the gravity field. The world became sharper, cleaner, more defined. Sarah described looking at her own hand and being able to see the blood flowing through the capillaries under her skin, a mesmerizing dance of biology she'd never noticed before. It wasn't a drug high. There was no euphoria, no disorientation. It was enhancement, a temporary upgrade to their standard operating systems. The food wasn't designed for pleasure. It was designed for optimization. Every bite had a documented, measurable effect on the body and the mind. The Zephyrians didn't eat for comfort or tradition. They consumed specific chemical compounds to achieve specific biological states. Taste was a secondary consideration, a mere side effect of the compounds interacting with their biology. For them, a meal was a calibration, a tune-up. It was the most utilitarian, unromantic view of sustenance imaginable, and yet the sensory experience was the most profound of James and Sarah's lives. The glow faded from the food as they ate it, the energy and nutrients absorbed. The vivid clarity of their perceptions lasted about half an hour before gently receding, leaving behind only the memory of a world seen in perfect, impossible focus. The lab wasn't a room with equipment. It was a garden of frozen light. Tall, intricate structures of crystal grew from the floor and ceiling. meeting in the middle like the branches of trees. They pulsed with a soft internal radiance. The air smelled of ozone and something sharp like mint and electricity. James stood in the center of it, feeling very much like a tourist in a cathedral. Lyra gestured to a space between two of the largest crystal formations. A stream of gold light hung in the air there, twisting and coiled like a slow-moving river of liquid lightning. It wasn't projecting from anything. It just was probability, Lyra said. Her voice was calm, but her reflective eyes were fixed on him with that unnerving intensity. A localized quantum field. It represents potential states. Possible outcomes, she turned to him. I want you to touch it. James looked from the shimmering stream to her and back again. His every human instinct recoiled. You don't touch things that visibly bend space. You don't put your hand in a river of fire that doesn't burn. No one's ever done that, he said, and it wasn't a question. It is a standard part of our early education, she replied, as if telling him about a grade school math class. It is how we learn the fundamental nature of reality, not through equations, through experience. The math comes later to describe what we already know. She extended her own slender hand toward the light, not touching it, just tracing its path in the air. It will not harm you. It does not exist on that level. He took a slow breath. He thought of the shuttle ride up, the briefing room, the song from Mars. This was why he'd volunteered. Not for diplomacy, for this. He stepped forward. The light didn't give off heat or cold. It gave off a feeling, a low hum that vibrated in his teeth, a pressure against his skin. He raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He could see the individual strands within the stream like threads of fate, weaving and unweaving themselves. He closed his eyes and pushed his hand into the light. It didn't feel like touching anything solid. It felt like dipping his hand into a current of pure mathematics. A cascade of information flooded his mind, not as words or images, but as pure understanding. He perceived the stream not as a single thing, but as 1,000 branching pathways, each one a different version of what could happen in the next second. He felt the weight of possibilities. The high-probability paths were strong, clear currents. The unlikely ones were faint, shimmering threads. He could feel them. He could feel the future as a tactile thing. Then he felt another presence. Not in the room, in the stream. Lyra's consciousness joined his not as a voice but as a harmonic. Her mind was ordered. A structured pattern of precise logic that moved through the probability field with purpose. His was chaotic, a storm of intuition and feeling. They didn't clash. They wove together. His intuitive leaps found the branching paths her logic would have missed. Her disciplined focus gave direction to his scattered insights. Alone, he was drowning in data. Alone, she was following a single narrow road. Together, they were more. A harmonic resonance built between their linked minds. A frequency of thought that was clearer, sharper, and more powerful than anything either could generate alone. They weren't sharing words. They were sharing the architecture of thought itself. Two different operating systems syncing up to run a program. Neither could execute solo. The technology didn't transmit language. It synchronized consciousness, allowing two minds to function as a single, blended processor, sharing not just data, but the very act of thinking. James's hand hovered a few inches from the light. It wasn't just golden. It was a dense knot of shimmering energy, coiled and writhing like a captured sunbeam made of liquid fire. The space around it warped visibly, a heat-haze distortion that made his eyes water. Every survival instinct he'd ever developed was screaming at him to pull back. This wasn't a thing you touched. This was a thing you observed from a very, very safe distance. Lyra's voice was calm beside him. It is not a physical substance. It will not burn you. Her own hand reached out not to push his but to guide his focus. Perceive the structure, not the light. He took a breath that felt too shallow and pushed his fingers forward. There was no impact, no heat, no cold. The sensation was nothing like skin meeting an object. It was his mind falling into a fast-moving river of raw information. The moment his fingertips passed the threshold, his consciousness overloaded. It wasn't a vision. It was a direct download of potentiality. He didn't see the future, he felt it. 1,000 branching paths exploded in his awareness, each one a vivid, simultaneous reality. In one, he pulled his hand back. In another, he stepped fully into the stream. In a third, far less likely path, the entire ship shuddered and vanished. These weren't vague ideas. They were tangible threads, each with its own weight, its own texture of likelihood. The strong probabilities felt like thick, sturdy ropes. The faint, improbable ones were like gossamer threads, almost too delicate to sense. He understood probability not as a percentage on a screen, but as a physical medium he was now standing in. He was a man suddenly able to feel the individual notes that made up a chord. His own thoughts were a chaotic storm against this new sense. The raw data was too much. He was drowning in it. Then he felt Lyra's presence. Not as a voice, but as a steady, logical anchor point in the chaos. Her consciousness linked with his, providing a framework. Her mind was a clean, sharp scalpel cutting through the noise. She didn't tell him what to do. She simply showed him how to navigate. She guided his awareness toward one of the stronger probability streams, a thick rope of light representing a very likely, very mundane outcome where nothing happened. Then she guided him toward a different, much finer thread, a shimmering possibility that was beautiful but fragile. Now, her thought impression came clear and calm. Gently, with a focus he didn't know he possessed, he nudged the thin, unlikely thread with his mind. It was like trying to push a soap bubble with a single thought. He directed it toward the thick, sturdy rope of the probable outcome. For a terrifying second, they repelled each other, two contradictory ideas refusing to merge. He felt the strain. Then, with a final mental push, the delicate thread touched the strong one. They didn't combine. They harmonized. The thick rope of probability didn't change. The thin thread didn't vanish. Instead, a new harmonic resonance bloomed where they met. A third possibility that was stronger and more complex than either had been alone. It was a new future, created from the fusion of the likely and the unlikely. He had just conducted a new reality into existence. The experience wasn't about seeing what would be. It was about feeling what could be and then choosing which chords to play. He withdrew his hand, his mind reeling, the echo of that new harmonic still ringing in a part of his soul he never knew existed. The connection between their minds didn't fade after the lab. It settled into a low hum, a shared space they could both step into. Lyra led him there now, into the heart of the problem. It wasn't a room or a screen. It was a conceptual landscape. James saw it as a vast, perfect, crystalline city. Every structure was flawless, every path perfectly optimized, every system running with breathtaking efficiency. But the city was static. Nothing new was being built. The inhabitants simply walked the same perfect paths over and over. This is our scientific progress, Lyra's thought impression came calm and clear. We have optimized our logic. We have refined our models to near perfection. She showed him specific challenges. A fundamental physics problem involving quantum gravity, represented as a towering seamless wall that blocked all paths forward. A biological puzzle concerning cellular regeneration, visualized as a locked door with a mechanism too complex for any key. A material science conundrum, a bridge that needed to span an impossible gap. Their most powerful AIs had worked on these problems for the equivalent of human centuries. They had mapped every variable, tested every logical permutation. They had hit a wall, not a wall of ignorance, but a wall of perfection. Their logic was so refined it could only work within its own established framework. It could not imagine a framework that didn't yet exist. They cannot make the illogical leap, Lyra explained. They cannot accept a premise that has no prior data to support it. They are trapped by their own excellence. She then showed him the human approach to similar problems. It looked nothing like the crystalline city. It was a messy, chaotic workshop. Tools were left lying around. Half-finished ideas sat on benches next to cups of cold coffee. A scientist would be staring at a wall, then suddenly look at a spinning children's top and have a breakthrough about planetary motion. An engineer would hear the way a pipe groaned and understand a new principle of structural stress. A programmer would dream about trees and wake up with a new sorting algorithm. It was inefficient. It was wasteful. It was brilliant. Lyra isolated specific instances from the vast library of human data they had collected. A complex engineering flaw in a deep space probe that had stumped ground control for weeks. A junior technician looking at the failure reports had a hunch it was a specific faulty capacitor, a part that had tested perfectly. He was right. A medical researcher, after years of failed attempts to culture a certain tissue, accidentally left a sample in a slightly cooler incubator overnight. On a whim, she didn't discard it. It worked. The Zephyrian AIs had analyzed both scenarios. The data did not support the technician's conclusion. The temperature shift was statistically insignificant to the medical sample. By all logical measures, these solutions should not have worked. But they did. The pattern recognition operates below the level of your conscious logic, Lyra said. You see connections between things that by all measurable data should not be connected. You call it a gut feeling, a lucky guess. We have no such concept. Our guesses are always calculated probabilities. Yours are not. And for problems that exist outside our current models of probability, your illogical guesses are the only tool that works. They didn't need human labor. They didn't need human resources. They needed a specific cognitive tool they had evolved beyond, a tool they had discarded as inefficient noise. They needed the ability to be wrong in interesting ways. They needed the creative spark that comes from a messy workshop, not a flawless crystal city. They were the ultimate proofreaders, but they had forgotten how to write the first draft. The harmonic altar looked like a pool of liquid crystal, its surface rippling with complex shifting light patterns. It pulsed slowly in time with the low thrum of the ship. James and Lyra stood facing each other across it. The chamber was empty except for them and the silent, watchful presence of the technology. This wasn't a public spectacle. This was a private calibration. The air felt heavy, charged. The ceremony was reversible, the technicians had assured him. A full reset was possible at any point, but the process was described as deeply intimate. It wasn't about sharing secrets. It was about sharing the structure of the self, the bedrock feelings, the core memories that made you who you are. The risk wasn't death. The risk was being truly known. A single tone echoed through the chamber, clear and pure. It was time. James looked at Lyra. Her reflective eyes held his. There was no ceremony official. The system itself would monitor their consent. Their voices spoke the two words at the exact same moment, their syllables matching perfectly. I do. The words hung in the air and the altar flashed. The light didn't just brighten. It reached out. Tendrils of soft radiance connected from the pool to their temples, not as physical wires but as beams of coherent energy. The merger didn't hurt. It was a sudden, profound absence of boundary. James's sense of where he ended and Lyra began simply dissolved. It was less like meeting a new person and more like realizing a part of your own mind had been silent your whole life and was now speaking. He felt her memories not as videos playing in his head, but as lived experiences. The crushing weight of royal expectation from childhood, the endless lessons in protocol and statecraft, the profound aching loneliness of being surrounded by courtiers who saw a title, not a person. He felt her fascination with humanity not as an academic interest, but as a desperate thirst for something real, something messy and warm and unpredictable. Her longing for a connection that wasn't dictated by duty or genetic compatibility matrices was a physical ache he now shared. In return, she received his life. She felt the grit of desert sand on a young boy's knees as he set up a telescope, the sheer, undiluted wonder of seeing Saturn's rings for the first time, a feeling so bright and sharp it was almost painful. The frustration of years spent listening to cosmic static, the stubborn hope that refused to die. The deep, steady love for Sarah, a calm harbor in the chaos of his obsession. The white-hot passion for discovery, the driving need to understand the universe that had been the central engine of his existence. She felt it all not as data but as her own emotion. It wasn't an invasion, it was a convergence. Their two consciousnesses flowed together like two streams merging into a single, wider river. His chaotic, emotional human mind and her structured, logical Zephyrian one didn't fight for dominance. They intertwined. His intuition gave color and feeling to her logic. Her precision gave structure and clarity to his passion. For a timeless period, they were a single, blended entity, more than the sum of its parts. They were a new kind of mind. Then, as gently as it began, the connection receded. The light tendrils faded. The sense of shared self withdrew, leaving two individuals standing apart again. But nothing was the same. They had shared the architecture of their souls. You don't come back from that unchanged. The silence in the chamber was different now. It was the quiet after a storm has passed, when the air is clear and everything looks new. The genetic models spun in the air between them, a double helix made of light and mathematics. It was the first analysis run after the quantum merger, using the new blended consciousness as a processing engine. The results were not what anyone expected. Human and Zephyrian DNA, separated by light years of independent evolution, shouldn't have been compatible. They used different base proteins. Their cellular machinery was built on different biological principles. The simulation showed something else. It showed a startling, unexpected synergy. The strands didn't clash. They interlocked. Key sequences from James's genome filled critical gaps in Lyra's and vice versa. The model predicted viable offspring. Not just viable, optimized. The news landed in the quiet of their private quarters like a physical object. James stared at the swirling genetic map, the implications unfolding in his mind with a cold, slow clarity. This wasn't just about him and Lyra anymore. This was about creating a new kind of person. A person who would be a citizen of nowhere. Not fully human, not fully Zephyrian. A biological bridge that belonged to both worlds and neither. The ethical weight of it was immense. You're talking about a child who would be a living experiment. A precedent. The first of a new species. Born from a partnership that was only days old. Who gets to make that decision? What rights would that child have? What home would they call their own? Lyra saw it differently. Her focus was on the capability projections the model spat out. The hybrid physiology wasn't an average of the two. It was an amplification. The simulations predicted a cellular efficiency that would grant a lifespan measured in centuries, not decades. More importantly, the neural architecture suggested an innate, heightened perception of quantum states. They wouldn't need a laboratory to touch probability. They might perceive it as naturally as humans perceive color. They would be natural-born explorers of the universe's deeper mysteries, Lyra said, her voice quiet with something akin to awe. She wasn't looking at a problem. She was looking at a key, a generation of children who could see the fabric of reality in a way their parents could only theorize about. James thought about his own childhood, the simple wonder of a backyard telescope. He tried to imagine a child who could look at a star and not just see a point of light, but perceive the quantum fluctuations in its core. The responsibility was staggering. You wouldn't be raising a son or a daughter. You would be raising a prototype. A being whose very existence could redefine what it meant to be intelligent life in the galaxy. They would face prejudice from both sides. They would carry the hopes and fears of two entire civilizations on their shoulders. Every stumble would be analyzed. Every success would be claimed. It was a lifetime of being a symbol, regardless of what they personally wanted. The potential was infinite. The risks were existential. A hybrid child wouldn't just be a blend of two people. They would be a fusion of two evolutionary paths. They could inherit humanity's creative intuition and the Zephyrians' disciplined logic in a perfect, inseparable mix. They might solve problems nobody else could even formulate. They could be the next great leap forward for both species. Or they could be profoundly lonely, caught between two worlds understood by neither. The future of both civilizations wouldn't be changed by treaties or technology exchanges alone. It would be changed in a nursery, by a child who saw the universe in a way no one ever had before. The question wasn't if it could happen. The question was whether they were ready for what came after. The chamber of the Galactic Council looked like a frozen nebula. Delegates from a dozen starfaring species occupied crystalline platforms that floated in a vast dark space. They were a gallery of bizarre biologies and advanced technologies, all united by a single common trait: profound skepticism. In the center of it all, James and Lyra stood on a simple, shared platform. They weren't using holoscreens or data slates. They were the presentation. The Council's scientific consensus was clear and had been for millennia. Consciousness was an epiphenomenon, a useful byproduct of complex neural computation, like heat from an engine. Interesting but not fundamental. The idea that it could influence the physical universe was considered a primitive superstition, something to be outgrown. You could feel the polite dismissal in the chamber, a silent judgment from beings who had mapped the quantum foam and built Dyson spheres. They were here to humor the newcomers, not to be educated by them. James took a breath. This wasn't about giving a speech. It was about demonstration. He and Lyra had spent weeks preparing this. They didn't argue with equations. They performed 3 specific actions. First, they jointly stabilized an unstable quantum particle cloud from across the room. Not with instruments, but through focused intention, their minds linked. The cloud, which had been flickering erratically, snapped into a perfect, steady state. A few of the delegates shifted on their platforms. Second, they guided a beam of light through a complex maze of prismatic filters without touching any controls, bending its path through what could only be described as collective will. The light obediently followed an impossible route, arriving at a sensor that confirmed its frequency had not changed. A low hum of consternation passed through the chamber. The third demonstration was the real point. They had taken a stubborn problem, faster-than-light communication. Every species used some variant of quantum entanglement, a complex, energy-intensive process that required massive relays. James and Lyra proposed something else. They called it resonance transmission. The concept came from a human metaphor, two tuning forks vibrating in sympathy across a room. They didn't send information through space. They created an identical quantum state in two places at once, using a synchronized consciousness as the tuning fork. Information wasn't transmitted. It was mirrored. They set up two containment units on opposite sides of the chamber. Inside each was an identical set of quantum particles in a base state. James and Lyra, their minds fully merged, focused on one unit. They didn't encode a message. They held a specific, complex emotional and conceptual pattern in their shared mind, a memory of the musical signal from Mars, combined with the feeling of first seeing Earth from orbit. The particles in the first unit vibrated, adopting a new, incredibly complex state. Simultaneously and instantaneously, the particles in the second unit 40 meters away adopted the exact same state. A receiver on the second unit decoded the state not as ones and zeros, but as the original emotional and conceptual pattern. They had sent a feeling across a distance without a signal, without a carrier wave, without any decay. The message wasn't just received, it was perfectly understood. The chamber was utterly silent. Then the Andromedan delegate, a being of swirling gas and light contained in a sophisticated field, did something unprecedented. Its form, usually a calm, controlled vortex, shuddered violently. Colors flashed through it in a chaotic storm. In the universal translation stream, its thought impression came through as a blast of pure, unshielded shock. Impossible. The medium is consciousness. You are using consciousness as the fabric. This wasn't a new communication method. It was proof of a new force, a fundamental interaction that worked through awareness itself. They hadn't just built a better radio. They had redefined physics. The silence in the nebula-like council chamber stretched, thick with the unspoken disbelief of a dozen advanced species. The resonance transmission demonstration had shattered a fundamental assumption, and the delegates were struggling to recalibrate their understanding of the universe. Then the air in the center of the chamber began to distort. It wasn't a ship or a person appearing. It was a shimmering, translucent form coalescing from the light itself, a projection so temporally unstable it hurt to look at directly. Its shape fluxed between a complex geometric solid and a formless cloud of light, never settling, existing in multiple states at once. This was a delegate from a civilization that didn't just travel through space. They navigated time itself. A low-frequency hum of alarm passed through the chamber. Time-shifted beings were the ultimate observers. They rarely, if ever, intervened in linear events. Their entire philosophy was built on the principle of non-interference with the probability streams of the present. To speak was to risk creating a paradox, to fracture a timeline. Their presence alone was a seismic event. Their judgment was final. The form stabilized into a vaguely humanoid shape made of flickering light. It didn't have a mouth or eyes, but a voice resonated through the chamber's translation system, clear and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the sound of inevitability. This proposal, it stated, the words hanging in the air with the weight of ages, will revolutionize galactic civilization within 47 standard years. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a molecule split. Among species that lived for millennia, a prediction measured in decades was not just specific. It was immediate. It was a done deal, written in a history they hadn't lived yet. Pronouncements from temporal beings weren't predictions or possibilities. They were confirmations. They were reports from the future delivered back to the past. A 47-year timeline wasn't a guess. It was the publication date. James felt the reality of it settle over him, colder and heavier than the vacuum of space. This wasn't about proving a theory anymore. It wasn't about personal choice or political alliance. Lyra's selection of him, his decision to volunteer, the merger of their minds. It wasn't a sequence of random events or bold choices. It was a fixed point, a historical inevitability that a being from the future had just traveled back to confirm. Their partnership wasn't an interesting experiment. It was the catalyst, the first domino in a chain reaction that would reshape everything. The time-shifted delegate didn't offer congratulations or warnings. It simply delivered a timestamp. The revolution had a schedule, and they were the clock. The projection flickered once, then dissolved back into the ambient light of the chamber, its disruptive work done. It left behind a room full of delegates who now understood they weren't witnessing a presentation. They were witnessing the first minutes of a new galactic age, and the two figures at the center of it were no longer pioneers. They were monuments. The old physics textbooks were wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally, categorically incomplete. The four fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, they govern the universe of objects, of things that bump into each other. But there is a fifth force, and it doesn't operate on matter. It operates on information, on meaning, on the fact of observation itself. Its field is consciousness. Its medium is awareness. Lyra laid it out not with complex math, but with simple patterns their merged perception had finally clarified. All their previous instruments were like cameras trying to take a picture of a sound. They were measuring the wrong dimension. The textbooks will have to be rewritten. Every chapter, every basic assumption about how reality is structured. The tension in the scientific community once the news broke wasn't just disagreement. It was an identity crisis. For centuries, consciousness was the ghost in the machine, a byproduct, an illusion. A fascinating side effect of a complex brain. To suggest it was a primary force as fundamental as gravity was heresy. It was like claiming the ocean was caused by the fish that swim in it. This fifth force doesn't work like the others. It isn't local. It doesn't diminish with distance. Two particles entangled across the galaxy are linked by this force. A human's intuitive leap about a problem light years away is a manifestation of it. It connects entities across space and time through a shared field of potentiality. It explains the anomalies science has always dismissed as coincidence or luck. That feeling of knowing who's on the phone before you answer it. The perfect idea that arrives in the shower. The scientist who has a breakthrough in a dream. The strange synchronicity of two people inventing the same thing on opposite sides of the world at the same time. These aren't statistical flukes. They are minor unconscious applications of the fifth force, tiny ripples in the field of conscious connection. The practical applications are not subtle. They change everything. Communication first. The resonance transmission they demonstrated isn't a faster signal. It's an instantaneous mirroring of state. There is no signal to intercept, no distance to cross. Then transportation. Why move an object through space fighting gravity and inertia when you can simply reposition its quantum state in the conscious field? You wouldn't travel. You would reappear. Energy production becomes a different conversation entirely. The universe is saturated with this conscious energy. Tapping it wouldn't be like mining a resource. It would be more like tuning an instrument to a frequency that already exists everywhere at once. The payoff is the force itself. It doesn't have a flashy name yet. Some are calling it the noetic field. Others, the resonance force. The label doesn't matter. The mechanism does. It is the force of connection. The thing that links an observer to the observed and makes the act of observation meaningful. It is the reason a particle behaves differently when watched. It is the fabric that allows a feeling in one mind to alter the state of a particle in another galaxy. It is the missing piece, the reason the universe isn't a cold, dead mechanism, but a responsive, interactive system. The fifth force is the universe's way of knowing itself, and we are the instruments it uses to do it. The appointment ceremony for the Prince Consort and co-director of Zephyrian research was a strange and beautiful mess. It was held at the UN headquarters, but the main hall looked nothing like itself. Crystalline Zephyrian structures had grown from the floor, intersecting with the familiar wooden podium and national flags. Sunlight filtered through the alien prisms, casting geometric patterns on the delegates in their business suits. James wore a specially tailored suit that incorporated strands of Zephyrian silver thread into the lapels. Lyra wore a human-style pantsuit under her traditional robes. The whole thing was broadcast live. It looked less like a diplomatic event and more like a very expensive, very weird wedding. The tension wasn't in the room. It was in the comment sections. On Earth, a vocal minority called James a traitor. He chose them over us, the headline screamed. Humanity's first defector. They saw his new title as a fancy name for a hostage or a collaborator. On the Zephyrian networks, the concern was different. Traditionalists saw his influence as a contamination, a dangerous injection of chaotic human emotion into their pristine logical systems. They worried Lyra was being swayed by sentiment, not strategy. Both sides were shouting, and James was stuck in the middle, trying to forge a path neither side had asked for. Their first official act was drafting the Accord. It wasn't a treaty between nations. It was a set of ethical guidelines for a new kind of existence. They laid out strict rules for the application of the fifth force, calling it resonance technology for public consumption. They established a joint review board for any new discoveries, with veto power on both sides. The section on potential offspring was the most carefully worded document in human history. It guaranteed any hybrid child dual citizenship, absolute autonomy over their own biological data, and the right to choose their own path, free from the expectations of being a symbol. They weren't creating an experiment. They were creating a person, with rights and protections built in before they even existed. The living arrangement was the practical solution. James and Lyra would split their time, 6 months of the year on the Zephyrian research vessel, continuing their work on the fifth force, 6 months on Earth, at a new joint facility built in neutral territory. It was a commute, but the destination was a different planet. The schedule was non-negotiable. It was the only way to maintain trust, to show both species that this partnership was a balance, not an absorption. James wouldn't vanish into the stars. He would be back, regularly. Sarah's new role was the masterstroke. She was appointed the official human liaison to the Zephyrian Research Directorate. It meant she had a seat at every table, access to every piece of data, and the authority to flag any project that seemed to disadvantage human interests. It also meant she got her own quarters on the Zephyrian ship for visits. It was a job crafted specifically for her skills as a diplomat and her unique insight into the man at the center of it all. She was the anchor, ensuring the human perspective wasn't just heard but integrated. The shock of first contact had faded, replaced by the hard, unglamorous work of building something that could last. The story was no longer about a strange ship in the sky or a royal declaration. It was about logistics and law, ethics and schedules. It was about making the incredible seem routine. The sustainable model wasn't built on grand gestures. It was built on clear rules, shared time, and the understanding that trust isn't given. It's built one careful, deliberate decision at a time. The real partnership began not with a ceremony, but with the mundane reality of making it work day after day, across the void between stars. First contact didn't begin with a declaration of war or a peace treaty. It started in a quiet briefing room with one man deciding to step forward. That single choice, powered by curiosity instead of fear, changed the script for our entire species. The universe turned out to be far stranger and more wonderful than our science ever predicted. It turns out the greatest distance isn't between stars, it's between minds. Their partnership proves that with enough courage and a little trust, even that unimaginable gap can be bridged.